Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the North Carolina mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the summer of 1908, the Asheville Citizen printed a brief notice regarding what it termed a domestic disturbance at a property in Madison County, deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The article, barely 4 paragraphs long, mentioned that the new owners of a residence known locally as the Blackthorne Mansion had contacted county authorities after discovering what the paper described as evidence of previous occupancy in a sealed portion of the house. The newspaper treated the matter as a minor property dispute, suggesting the family had perhaps found old furniture or personal effects left behind by former residents. The article concluded by noting that Sheriff Thomas Caldwell of Marshall had visited the property and that no further action was anticipated at that time. What the newspaper failed to mention was that this brief report marked the beginning of one of the most disturbing cases in Appalachian history, one that had remained hidden behind locked doors for over 30 years. The Blackthorne Mansion sat on 60 acres of heavily wooded mountain land, approximately 12 miles from the town of Marshall, the Madison County seat. The property occupied a hollow between 2 ridges, accessible only by a narrow road that became impassable during winter months and after heavy rains. The isolation was profound even by the standards of the region, where homesteads were often separated by miles of dense forest and treacherous terrain. The Blue Ridge had long been a place where people came to disappear, whether from the law, from debts, or from society itself. In such remote hollows, secrets could keep for decades, and doors could remain closed for a lifetime. What the Hollowell family discovered when they finally opened that sealed door would reveal horrors that the mountains had hidden since the years following the Civil War. The Hollowell family arrived in Madison County in May of 1908, their carriages loaded with trunks and furnishings for what they intended to be a summer retreat from the oppressive heat of Winston-Salem. Edmund Hollowell, 42 years of age, had built a successful tobacco brokerage over 15 years and sought a mountain residence where his family could escape the humid lowland summers that so often brought illness. His wife, Virginia, formerly Virginia Ashworth of Richmond, had been a music teacher before their marriage in 1891 and was known in Winston-Salem society for her refined manner and charitable work with the Methodist Church. Their children accompanied them on that journey. Samuel, 14, a studious boy preparing for eventual enrollment at the University of North Carolina. Catherine, 11, described by family friends as imaginative and prone to nervousness, and infant Ruth, just 8 months old, born the previous September. County land records preserved in the Madison County Courthouse document the purchase in precise terms. Edmund Hollowell acquired the Blackthorne property on the 3rd of April 1908 for the sum of $1,200, a price notably below market value for a 3-story Victorian mansion on 60 acres of mountain land. The deed specified that the sale included all original furnishings remaining in the residence, a clause that would later take on darker significance. The property had been managed by a trust established in 1876, and Edmund dealt only with attorneys in Asheville who seemed eager to finalize the sale with minimal discussion of the home's history. Neighbors in the scattered homesteads surrounding the property observed the family's arrival with curiosity. The Hendersons, whose farm lay 2 miles to the east, later recalled thinking the Hollowells seemed respectable, but perhaps overly ambitious in taking on such an isolated and long vacant property. Martha Henderson noted that the wife appeared uneasy from the start, glancing at the tree line as though expecting something to emerge from the woods. The family could not have known what awaited them in that house. They saw only a handsome mountain home, a retreat from summer heat, a place where their children might thrive in the clean mountain air. The Blackthorne Mansion was constructed in 1871 by Dr. Cornelius Blackthorne, a physician who had relocated to Madison County following the conclusion of the Civil War. Blackthorne had served as a surgeon in the Confederate Army, stationed at field hospitals where he treated the catastrophic wounds inflicted by modern weaponry on human bodies. Military records indicate he performed hundreds of amputations and other procedures under primitive conditions, experiences that colleagues suggested had fundamentally altered his disposition. He arrived in the North Carolina mountains with his wife Prudence, formerly Prudence Whitmore of Charlottesville, Virginia, and purchased the land in the hollow with cash payment, an unusual transaction for the time. The house he built was ambitious for such a remote location, a 3-story Victorian structure with 12 rooms, a full cellar, and an expansive attic space. Dr. Blackthorne's reputation in Madison County was complicated. His medical knowledge was respected and occasionally sought for difficult cases when the local physicians were unavailable. Yet those who encountered him socially described a cold and clinical manner that made conversation uncomfortable. He spoke of human beings as though they were mechanisms to be studied rather than souls to be comforted. His wife Prudence was seen even less frequently than her husband. Neighbors described her as a shadow of a woman, thin and pale, who rarely spoke and never left the property after their first year of residence. The Blackthornes had no children. Though the doctor was known to take in patients for extended treatment at the mansion, individuals suffering from afflictions of the mind that families preferred to address privately rather than through public asylums. These patients would arrive and rarely be seen again, their departures explained as transfers to other facilities or unfortunate deaths from their conditions. Dr. Blackthorne died in March of 1876 under circumstances recorded officially as heart failure. His wife supposedly departed for family in Virginia shortly thereafter, though no records confirm her arrival or subsequent life. The house stood empty for over 30 years, maintained by a trust and awaiting a buyer who never came until Edmund Hollowell inquired about mountain properties. The Hollowells spent their first weeks in the mansion attempting to transform the long vacant house into a comfortable summer home. Virginia directed the airing of rooms, the beating of rugs, and the polishing of the original furnishings that had sat untouched for over 3 decades. Despite her efforts, she confided to her sister in a letter dated the 28th of May, 1908, that the house retained an oppressive atmosphere that no amount of sunlight or fresh mountain air seemed to dispel. The children, however, embraced their new surroundings with the enthusiasm of youth. Samuel and Catherine explored the grounds, discovering an overgrown garden, a collapsed stable, and the remnants of what appeared to be a root cellar behind the main house. They wandered through the accessible rooms of the mansion, finding old medical texts in the study and faded portraits of unsmiling figures they assumed to be previous occupants. It was Samuel who first discovered the door on the 3rd floor. Unlike the other doors in the house, this one was reinforced with iron bands and secured with a heavy padlock that had rusted but remained firmly in place. The boy reported his finding to his father, who examined the door with growing curiosity. Edmund's subsequent inquiries to the property manager in Asheville yielded little information. The attorneys explained only that Dr. Blackthorne's will had specified that certain rooms remained sealed until a buyer took legal possession of the property, at which point they became the new owner's concern. The trust had honored this stipulation for 32 years. Edmund, a practical man untroubled by superstition, decided to send for a locksmith from Asheville to open the sealed room. Virginia opposed this decision with an intensity that surprised her husband. In her letters, she described a profound unease about opening rooms that had been deliberately closed for so long. "There are some doors that are locked for good reason," she wrote. "Some things are meant to stay buried." Edmund dismissed her concerns as feminine nervousness. The locksmith was summoned and a date was set. The family would soon learn that Virginia's intuition had been correct. Jonas Webb arrived at the Blackthorne Mansion on the morning of the 14th of July, 1908, his tools carried in a leather satchel worn soft from years of use. Webb had worked as a locksmith in Asheville for over 2 decades and had opened countless locks of every variety. Yet, he would later testify that the mechanism on the 3rd floor door gave him unusual difficulty. The lock was European in design, he explained in his statement to Sheriff Caldwell, not typical American hardware but something more sophisticated, meant to keep people out rather than simply secure a room. He worked at it for nearly an hour while the family waited in the hallway, Virginia clutching infant Ruth and keeping Catherine close while Samuel watched the locksmith's efforts with fascination. When the lock finally yielded and Webb pulled open the heavy door, air that had been sealed for over 30 years rushed out to meet them. The smell was immediate and unmistakable. Webb would later describe it as like opening a tomb, a staleness mixed with something chemical and something else beneath that he could not identify. Beyond the door lay a narrow staircase leading upward into darkness, dust covering every visible surface in a thick gray layer that showed no footprints, no disturbance of any kind. Virginia immediately insisted that the children remain downstairs with her while Edmund and Webb investigated. Her voice carried an edge of fear that her husband had never heard before. Edmund lit a lantern and began his ascent, Webb following close behind. The attic was larger than they had expected, a finished space spanning nearly the entire length of the house. Dormer windows lined both sides, but had been boarded from the inside, blocking all natural light. As Edmund raised the lantern, the room's contents emerged from shadow, medical equipment arranged with careful precision. A surgical table at the center of the space, shelves along the walls holding jars that contained specimens impossible to identify in the dim and flickering light. And in the far corner, partially concealed behind a folding privacy screen, the first indication that something terrible had occurred in this room. Behind the privacy screen in the far corner of the attic, Edmund Hollowell and Jonas Webb discovered what would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. A bed frame constructed of heavy oak stood against the wall, equipped with leather restraints at the positions where wrists and ankles would be secured. The leather had darkened and cracked with age, but remained firmly attached to the frame by iron bolts. Beneath the bed, the wooden floorboards were stained a deep brownish black in patterns that spread outward in ways that suggested the source had been liquid and plentiful. Beside the bed stood a small table, arranged with surgical instruments that gleamed even through the dust that coated them. Scalpels of various sizes, bone saws with fine-toothed blades, clamps and retractors, and other tools that neither man could identify but whose purposes seemed evident in that terrible context. Everything had been arranged with meticulous care, as though the person who had placed them there intended to return and resume their work. But it was the desk near the boarded window that held the most disturbing evidence. 3 leather-bound journals sat stacked beside detailed anatomical drawings executed with obvious skill. Folders contained what appeared to be medical case files, each labeled with numbers rather than names. Edmund opened one journal and read only a few lines before closing it again, his hands trembling. Webb needed no further convincing. He departed immediately for Marshall to notify Sheriff Thomas Caldwell, riding hard despite the summer heat. Edmund descended the stairs and closed the attic door, though he could not bring himself to lock it again. Virginia met him at the bottom, with questions he found himself unable to answer adequately. How does one describe such a room to his wife, to the mother of his children sleeping in the house below it? Samuel, watching from the yard, would later recall that his father's face had gone completely white, as though he had seen something that had drained the very life from him. The family gathered in the parlor as evening fell, the attic door standing open above them in the darkness, waiting for the authorities to arrive. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell arrived at the Blackthorne Mansion on the morning of the 15th of July, 1908, accompanied by 2 deputies and a grim determination to understand what the locksmith had described in such agitated terms the previous evening. Caldwell was a veteran lawman of 20 years who had investigated murders, feuds, and every manner of violence that occurred in the remote mountain county, yet he would later write in his personal journal that nothing had prepared him for what he encountered in that attic. He ascended the narrow staircase with his lantern raised and spent nearly an hour in the space before descending to inform his deputies that they would be conducting a thorough investigation, one that would require careful documentation of everything they found. What followed was one of the earliest detailed crime scene investigations in Madison County history. The deputies inventoried every item in the attic, while Caldwell recorded their findings in his official report. They counted 47 specimen jars arranged on shelves along the eastern wall, each containing preserved organs and tissue samples suspended in chemical solution. Every jar had been meticulously labeled in a precise hand, with dates ranging from 1872 to 1876, though no names or other identifying information appeared on any label. The surgical equipment was consistent with medical practice of the era, but present in quantities that far exceeded what any single physician would require for legitimate practice. Multiple sets of scalpels, several bone saws, dozens of clamps and retractors suggested not occasional medical treatment, but sustained and repeated procedures. The restraints on the bed frame showed clear evidence of long-term use. The leather at the wrist positions had been worn smooth by repeated friction, and the wood of the frame itself had become discolored by what appeared to be bodily fluids absorbed over many applications. Most significant were the 3 leather-bound journals found on the desk, written in Dr. Blackthorne's precise handwriting. These volumes documented procedures performed on subjects identified only by numbers, never by names, describing in clinical detail experiments that no legitimate physician would perform on a living human being. Sheriff Caldwell's official report devoted considerable attention to the contents of Dr. Blackthorne's 3 journals, which together comprised over 400 pages of detailed entries spanning from 1872 to early 1876. The doctor's stated purpose, articulated in the opening pages of the first volume, was to understand the physical basis of human consciousness and emotion through systematic study of the living brain. Blackthorne wrote that the war had shown him the remarkable resilience of the human body and had convinced him that the mind itself must have a physical location that could be identified, studied, and ultimately understood through careful experimentation. His subjects were described throughout as patients suffering from various afflictions of the mind: hysteria, melancholia, moral insanity, and other conditions for which families of the afflicted sought treatment away from public asylums, where such diagnoses brought shame and social consequences. Blackthorne presented himself in these pages as providing a service, offering discreet care for those whom society preferred to forget. The progression of entries revealed a disturbing evolution. Early observations appeared conventional, documenting symptoms and attempting various treatments common to the era. But by the middle of the first journal, the entries shifted toward experimental procedures that no legitimate physician would condone. Blackthorne described surgeries performed on conscious subjects, his justification being that unconscious patients could not report the effects of his interventions on their thoughts and perceptions. He documented their responses to various stimuli, with clinical detachment recording screams and pleas as mere data points in his research. His frustration grew as the journals progressed. Despite dozens of procedures, he could not locate what he termed the seat of the soul, the specific structure that housed consciousness and emotion. Each failure drove him to more extreme interventions. The final entries from February 1876 described his most ambitious procedure yet, one he believed would finally yield the answers he sought. He wrote of complications that arose during this operation and of a subject who had been under his observation longer than any other, one whose responses he knew intimately. The subject's identity remained concealed behind a number, but the implications were deeply troubling. Sheriff Caldwell dedicated the following weeks to the painstaking task of identifying Dr. Blackthorne's victims through the evidence recovered from the attic. The coded case files provided dates of arrival and numbered subject designations but no names, requiring the sheriff to cross-reference this information with county records, asylum admission logs, and newspaper notices of missing persons from the 1,870 seconds. He sent inquiries to sheriffs in neighboring counties and to institutions across western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, seeking reports of individuals who had disappeared after being sent for private medical treatment. A disturbing pattern emerged from these efforts. The victims came from across the region, often from families of modest means who could not afford the costs of institutional care, but who had scraped together enough to pay for private treatment that promised discretion and personal attention. Young women diagnosed with hysteria, a common classification for any female behavior that deviated from social expectations. Men suffering from what would now be recognized as shell shock from their service in the war, veterans who had returned home changed in ways their families could not understand or manage. Elderly patients whose minds had begun to fail, whose care had become burdensome to relatives struggling with their own hardships. These families had paid Dr. Blackthorne handsomely to take their troubled relatives, believing they were providing compassionate care away from the stigma of public asylums. They received periodic letters reporting on their loved ones' conditions, and eventually they received final notifications that their relatives had succumbed to their afflictions or had been transferred to other facilities for specialized treatment. No family ever saw their relative again. Through careful matching of dates, descriptions, and circumstances, Sheriff Caldwell identified at least 11 victims from the evidence in the attic. Their names were recorded in his official report, their fates finally documented after decades of uncertainty. But the sheriff noted with grim certainty that the actual number was likely significantly higher. Blackthorne's journals referenced subjects whose corresponding files were never found, suggesting that some records had been destroyed or that additional victims remained entirely unidentified, their fates known only to the doctor who had ended their lives. As the investigation progressed, Sheriff Caldwell's attention turned increasingly toward a question that had troubled him from the beginning. What had become of Prudence Blackthorne? The official account held that she had departed for her family in Virginia shortly after her husband's death in March 1876. Yet Caldwell could find no evidence to support this claim. He sent inquiries to authorities in Charlottesville, where her family had resided, and received replies indicating that Prudence had never arrived and that her relatives had heard nothing from her since early 1876. No travel records documented her passage on any stage line or railroad. No correspondence bearing her hand existed after February of that year. No death certificate had been filed in any Virginia county under her maiden or married name. She had simply vanished, and for 32 years no one had questioned the convenient explanation that she had gone home to family. The final entries in Dr. Blackthorne's journal took on new and horrifying significance when read with this knowledge. In February 1876, the doctor wrote of preparing for his most important procedure, one to be performed on what he termed the most perfect subject. This subject had been under his observation for years, he wrote. He knew her responses intimately, understood her constitution, had documented her reactions to countless stimuli over the course of their time together. Her sacrifice would represent the culmination of his life's work, the final experiment that would reveal the secrets he had sought for so long. The implication was unmistakable. Dr. Blackthorne's final experiment had been performed on his own wife. The largest specimen jars on the attic shelves bore dates from February 1876, the same month Prudence had supposedly departed for Virginia. Sheriff Caldwell ordered a search of the mansion grounds for additional evidence of what he now believed had been not just murder, but something far worse. Deputies excavated the collapsed root cellar behind the house, working through layers of earth and debris. What they discovered beneath the cellar floor confirmed the sheriff's darkest suspicions and revealed that Prudence Blackthorne had not been the doctor's only victim to be buried on the property. The excavation of the root cellar began on the 20th of July, 1908, and continued for 5 days under the supervision of Sheriff Caldwell and Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a physician from Asheville, who possessed rare experience in forensic examination of human remains. The Hollowell family had been relocated to a hotel in Marshall at the county's expense, Virginia insisting that her children not witness whatever horrors might emerge from the earth behind their summer home. The work was painstaking and grim. Deputies dug carefully through the cellar floor, removing soil layer by layer, while Dr. Whitfield examined each section for evidence of burial. They did not have to dig long before finding what they sought. The first remains were discovered at a depth of approximately 2 feet, and further excavation revealed additional bodies buried beneath at varying depths, suggesting interment over a period of several years. By the conclusion of the excavation, the team had recovered skeletal remains representing at least 9 individuals. The bodies had been buried without coffins, shrouds, or markers of any kind, placed directly into the earth and covered over as though they were refuse rather than human beings. The fragmentary condition of the remains and the absence of dental records from that era made identification extraordinarily difficult. Dr. Whitfield could determine approximate age and sex for most of the remains, but names would require matching these findings to the missing persons reports that Sheriff Caldwell had been collecting. The most disturbing aspect of Dr. Whitfield's examination was the evidence of surgical intervention present on multiple remains. Several skulls showed sections of bone that had been cleanly removed using a surgical saw, the cuts precise and deliberate. Long bones bore similar saw marks, suggesting additional procedures. Most troubling was Whitfield's observation that several skulls showed evidence of healing around the surgical openings. New bone growth that indicated the victims had survived the initial procedures and lived for some time afterward, imprisoned in that attic with portions of their skulls permanently removed. They had been alive while Blackthorne conducted his experiments, conscious subjects in his quest to locate the seat of the soul. As news of the discoveries at the Blackthorne Mansion spread through Madison County, Sheriff Caldwell expanded his investigation to interview longtime residents about their recollections of the doctor and his household. What emerged from these interviews was a troubling pattern that would disturb the sheriff for the rest of his life. Many in the community had harbored suspicions about Dr. Blackthorne, but had remained silent for over 3 decades. Neighbors whose homesteads lay within a mile of the mansion recalled hearing sounds at night, particularly during the years between 1873 and 1876. These sounds were screams, they admitted now, though at the time they had attributed them to patients in distress from their mental conditions. The doctor was treating the afflicted, they had reasoned, and such treatment was bound to cause disturbance. The postmaster in Marshall, now elderly but still sharp in his recollections, noted that letters addressed to Prudence Blackthorne had been returned unopened after early 1876, marked by the doctor as no longer at this address. He had thought it strange, but had not questioned a professional man's word. The owner of the general store in Marshall had observed that Dr. Blackthorne's regular purchases included large quantities of chloroform, laudanum, and other chemicals in amounts that seemed excessive for a single physician treating occasional patients. He had assumed the doctor knew his business better than a shopkeeper could judge. The most significant testimony came from Martha Hensley in 1908, an elderly woman of 73, but in the 1,870 a young housemaid who had worked briefly at the mansion. Hensley stated that one night in late 1874, she had witnessed Dr. Blackthorne carrying something heavy wrapped in sheets down from the attic and out toward the root cellar. She had seen enough of the shape beneath those sheets to know it was human. She fled the property the next morning, telling no one what she had witnessed, and she had carried that secret for 34 years until the investigation compelled her testimony. The isolation of the region and the deference afforded to a professional man had allowed these crimes to continue unchallenged while an entire community looked away. The investigation necessarily turned to re-examine the circumstances surrounding Dr. Cornelius Blackthorne's death in March 1876, 1 month after his wife's supposed departure for Virginia. The original death certificate listed heart failure as the cause and bore Dr. Blackthorne's own signature, an impossibility that had apparently troubled no one at the time. Sheriff Caldwell located the filing clerk who had processed the document in 1876, now an old man living in Marshall, who admitted that the doctor had provided the completed form in advance with instructions that it be submitted to the county upon notification of his death. The clerk had thought it an unusual but not unreasonable precaution for a man living alone in such isolation. The body had been discovered by a delivery driver who arrived at the mansion to find the doctor dead in his study. The local physician who examined the remains spent only minutes with the body before declaring the death consistent with the certificate's claim of heart failure. No autopsy was performed despite the unusual circumstances of a man dying alone after his wife's sudden departure. The body was buried in the Marshall Cemetery within 2 days, and the matter was considered closed. In July 1908, Sheriff Caldwell obtained authorization to exhume Dr. Blackthorne's remains for examination by Dr. Whitfield. The findings were revelatory. Whitfield discovered evidence of significant sedation in the remaining tissue, chemicals consistent with the substances found in the attic. More significantly, the doctor's rib cage showed evidence of an incision made with surgical precision, a cut that had opened the chest cavity. The apparent conclusion was that Dr. Blackthorne had taken his own life through a method consistent with his macabre interests, sedating himself before performing one final procedure. Whether he acted from guilt over his wife's murder, from despair at his failure to find what he sought, or from a desire to experience death itself as his ultimate study remained unknowable. A note found among his effects and previously dismissed as religious sentiment took on new meaning. "I go now to see what I have so long studied." The discoveries at the Blackthorne Mansion left the Hollowell family shattered in ways that would persist long after they departed Madison County. Virginia's reaction was immediate and unequivocal. She informed Edmund that they could never return to the house, that she would not spend another night under that roof, regardless of the financial consequences. Edmund found himself torn between his wife's absolute conviction and the practical reality that he had invested his life savings in the property. The $1,200 he had paid represented years of careful accumulation, and the thought of abandoning it entirely was difficult for a man of his pragmatic nature to accept. Yet he could not argue against Virginia's revulsion, for he shared it even if he could not admit so openly. The children responded to the trauma in different ways that troubled their parents. Samuel, at 14 old enough to understand what had been found, developed nightmares that left him screaming in the night, yet he also exhibited a morbid fascination with the case that Virginia found deeply disturbing. He asked questions constantly, sought out newspaper accounts, and seemed unable to stop thinking about what had occurred in the attic above his bedroom. Catherine, by contrast, refused to discuss the house at all. She would not speak its name or acknowledge any reference to their time there, retreating into silence whenever the subject arose. Infant Ruth was too young to understand, yet she had been inconsolable throughout their stay in Marshall, crying for hours without apparent cause, as though she sensed the distress surrounding her. The family's attempts to sell the property proved futile. The notoriety of the case and the ongoing legal proceedings regarding the human remains found on the grounds made any sale impossible. Virginia's correspondence with her sister in Richmond during this period reveals the depth of her anguish. "It is as though we opened a door that should have remained forever closed," she wrote in September 1908, "and now we cannot escape what we let out. We are tainted by our association with that house, marked by what we discovered. I fear we shall never be free of it." The legal proceedings that followed the investigation were unprecedented in Madison County history. A coroner's inquest into deaths that had occurred over 30 years prior, with the perpetrator himself long dead and beyond earthly justice. The inquest, convened in August 1908 at the Marshall Courthouse, presided over by Coroner William Hutchins, with Sheriff Caldwell presenting the evidence his investigation had compiled. Testimony was heard over the course of 6 days, drawing crowds that filled the courtroom and spilled onto the street outside. Witnesses described what had been found in the attic, the contents of the journals, and the remains recovered from the root cellar. Dr. Whitfield presented his forensic findings in clinical detail that left many in attendance visibly shaken. The identification of victims from the recovered remains was presented to the court, including the confirmation that one set of remains belonged to Prudence Blackthorne. Her identity had been established through a distinctive healed fracture in her left arm that matched childhood medical records obtained from her family's physician in Virginia. She had broken the arm in a fall at age 9, and the bone had healed with a slight misalignment that Dr. Whitfield identified in the remains recovered from the cellar. The doctor's wife had never left Madison County. Families of other identified victims attended the proceedings, some traveling considerable distances to finally learn the fates of relatives who had vanished decades earlier. The formal finding of the inquest declared that Cornelius Blackthorne had murdered at least 15 people between 1,872 and 1,876 through medical experimentation, though the actual number was likely higher. Public outcry followed the proceedings, with newspapers across North Carolina demanding to know how such crimes could have gone undetected for so long. Questions were raised about the medical profession's lack of oversight, about the ease with which a physician could operate without scrutiny in isolated regions, about the vulnerability of those deemed mentally afflicted. But the hardest questions were directed inward, toward a community that had heard the screams and looked away, that had noticed the signs and remained silent, that had allowed a monster to operate in their midst, because he wore a professional man's respectability. The Blackthorne case left permanent marks on Madison County and on the individuals who had been drawn into its darkness. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell served 3 more years in his position before retiring in 1911. His health deteriorated and his spirit diminished. His personal journal from this period, preserved by his family and later donated to the County Historical Society, reveals a man haunted by what he had uncovered. He described recurring nightmares about the attic, dreams in which he climbed those narrow stairs again and again, only to find the room expanded into an endless space filled with jars he could never finish counting. He wrote that he could not pass the turnoff to the Blackthorne property without feeling physically ill, and that he had come to believe some places absorbed the evil done within them and never released it. Dr. Marcus Whitfield returned to Asheville but found himself unable to resume his general practice. The case had ignited in him a determination to understand the criminal mind, and he devoted his subsequent career to the emerging field of criminal pathology, consulting on cases throughout the South and lecturing on forensic examination techniques. He never spoke publicly about the Blackthorne case but referenced it obliquely in his writings as the investigation that had shown him how medicine could be perverted into an instrument of horror. The Blackthorne Mansion itself stood empty until 1911, when it was purchased at auction for a mere $200 by a timber company interested only in the lumber. Workers who demolished the structure reported disturbing experiences throughout the process: tools going missing, sounds from empty rooms, an oppressive feeling of being watched. The company cleared the timber from the property and departed, leaving the land to return to forest. For decades afterward, locals avoided the hollow where the mansion had stood, believing it cursed ground where nothing wholesome would grow. The Hollowell family relocated permanently to Virginia, and by all accounts, they never spoke of that summer again. Samuel Hollowell's later correspondence with a researcher revealed that he never stopped dreaming about the attic he had glimpsed only briefly through an open door. Modern examination of the Blackthorne case by historians, criminologists, and medical ethicists has placed Dr. Cornelius Blackthorne within the disturbing lineage of physicians who exploited their authority to commit atrocities. His experiments, conducted in that remote mountain attic between 1872 and 1876, predated but foreshadowed later horrors perpetrated in the name of scientific advancement. Scholars have noted the chilling similarities between Blackthorne's methodical documentation of suffering and the clinical detachment exhibited by medical criminals in subsequent decades. His case demonstrates that the capacity for such evil existed long before it became systematized, and that isolation and authority could enable a single determined individual to commit acts as monstrous as any state-sponsored program. Analysis of the case reveals how Blackthorne's status provided cover for his crimes. As a physician, he commanded automatic respect and deference from a community inclined to trust professional authority. As a Confederate veteran who had served his cause in the medical corps, he carried additional standing in a region where such service was honored. His preference for isolation was interpreted as the eccentricity of a learned man rather than the concealment strategy of a predator. His coldness was attributed to the traumas of war, rather than recognized as the absence of human empathy. The pattern of his victim selection demonstrated calculated predation upon the vulnerable. He chose individuals from families without the power or resources to investigate when their relatives failed to return. The mentally afflicted were ideal victims precisely because their disappearances could be explained by their conditions and because their families were often relieved to be free of the burden of their care. The psychological profile emerging from Blackthorne's journals suggests a man who had been desensitized to human suffering during the war and who subsequently rationalized his crimes as legitimate scientific pursuit. He convinced himself that his victims were contributing to knowledge that would benefit humanity, that their suffering served a higher purpose. This capacity for rationalization, combined with the systemic factors that enabled his concealment, reveals the darker possibilities that exist when medical authority operates without oversight, and when communities choose comfortable silence over uncomfortable questions. The site where the Blackthorne Mansion once stood is now part of the Pisgah National Forest, the hollow reclaimed by hardwood and pine in the century since the structure was demolished. No obvious traces remain of the house itself, the foundations long since buried beneath accumulated leaf litter and forest growth. A visitor to the location today would find only a quiet clearing where the trees grow slightly different than in surrounding areas, a subtle indication that the land was once disturbed. Yet the stories surrounding this place have never ceased. Hikers who have wandered into the hollow report unusual experiences that they struggle to explain rationally. Sounds like distant screams that fade when approached. A pervasive feeling of being watched from the dense tree line. Electronic equipment malfunctioning without cause and returning to normal function once the area is departed. Forest Service workers familiar with the history avoid the hollow when possible, and those who must enter report an oppressive atmosphere that lifts only when they leave. In 1987, an archaeological survey team from a state university attempted to locate and document the mansion's foundations. The project was abandoned after 3 days when team members reported psychological distress, including anxiety, nightmares, and auditory hallucinations. The team leader noted in her report that she could not scientifically explain what her team had experienced, but that she would not recommend further investigation of the site. The names of those identified as Dr. Blackthorne's victims deserve to be spoken aloud as memorial. Margaret Simmons, William Tate, Elizabeth Monroe, James Crawford, Sarah Whitfield, Thomas Jennings, Prudence Blackthorne, and others whose names were matched to remains during that terrible summer of 1908. They were real people who suffered unimaginable horrors in that attic, and their memory should not be forgotten. Questions remain that will likely never be answered. How many victims were there truly? Were there accomplices who were never identified? What became of the case files that were never found? The Blackthorne case endures as a reminder of the evil that can hide behind respectable facades, the importance of vigilance toward authority, and the way that places seem to absorb the trauma of what occurred within them. The forest clearing is quiet now, but it holds secrets that may never be fully known.